What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros with 10 matchups to avoid for Week 15. Before I get into the list, if you want a chance to win a glorious fantasy football championship belt for your league, courtesy of our good friends at Trophy Smack, the #1 destination for epic fantasy football trophies, you need to subscribe to the FantasyPros YouTube channel right now. Drop a comment below on this video, and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can know when new videos are up and to claim your prize. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. First up, Tua Tagovailoa versus the New York Jets. Tua Tagovailoa's playoff schedule is a hard pass for me, and it starts this week with the New York Jets. The Jets have allowed an average of less than 13 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and Tua has already fallen victim to that statistic. Tua had just 21 completions on 30 attempts for 243 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, and he lost a fumble. It was just an all-around awful fantasy performance. The Dolphins won the game easily, but when it comes to Tua versus top-tier defenses, it's just an awful fantasy combination. And to make matters worse, Tua is coming off a terrible performance in Week 14 against the Tennessee Titans. In what should have been an advantageous matchup, Tua had 23 completions for 240 yards and 0 touchdowns. When you're a pocket passer with no rushing upside, you just can't put up high fantasy production without multiple passing touchdowns. I expect Tua to struggle again this week. Kenneth Walker versus Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Eagles' run defense has been a no-go all season long. They have been a bit vulnerable over the past couple of weeks, so maybe that has people feeling like Kenneth Walker could have a strong game. Last week, Tony Pollard had a decent game, but his fantasy points were propped up by receiving work. Christian McCaffrey had a strong game against them, but he is Christian McCaffrey. And James Cook had a good game against them, but that also was propped up by receiving work. On the ground, the Eagles are still one of the most difficult matchups in the entire league. The only saving grace for running backs outside of CMC is those that have receiving upside. And while Kenneth Walker did have strong target share last week, that usage was really outside of the norm for him. Walker's groundwork won't be enough to carry him through this matchup, and it's best to avoid him if you can. Gus Edwards versus Jacksonville. Similar to Philadelphia's defense, you can find some outlier games where running backs tore them up, but for the most part, the Jags are a very difficult matchup for opposing running backs. The strong performances against the Jags have typically come from running backs that either have elite talent or steady, strong volume, and Gus Edwards has neither of those. The Ravens are committed to operating a committee, and Gus Edwards is touchdown dependent, with his snaps and touches rapidly decreasing. The Jags defense averages less than a half touchdown per game to opposing running backs, giving up a total of just 5 rushing touchdowns to running backs this year. They are top 5 in fewest rushing yards allowed to opponents. Gus Edwards has a total of 14 carries over the past 2 games for 41 yards and no touchdowns. There's just no way to feel comfortable with him this week. Tony Pollard versus Buffalo. Tony Pollard is on a roll. Although his 3-touchdown game streak did come to an end, he still had a solid fantasy performance with 7 receptions on 8 targets for 37 yards to help save the day. Pollard should still have a solid floor here, but I think his upside will be capped. Attacking Buffalo through the air has just been typically the right move. Even in low-volume performances, passing touchdowns have been ample against the Bills, especially over the past 7 games where the Bills have allowed 13 of their 17 passing touchdowns on the year. They've been decimated with injuries, and the pass defense is just running cold. I would expect the Cowboys to push heavy volume through Dak Prescott, especially in the red zone, and Tony Pollard could struggle to find the end zone. Drake London versus Carolina. Drake London is coming off a huge performance, catching 10 of his 11 targets for 172 yards. It was his best performance of his young career. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it did come against the Bucs, a notoriously bad pass defense. And this week he faces the Panthers, one of the best pass defenses in the NFL. Aside from guys like Mike Evans, who have just been playing on another level this season, Tyreek Hill and Justin Jefferson, receivers have consistently struggled against the Panthers. The problem is that they simply don't allow a ton of yardage. And that simply doesn't work for a guy like Drake London, whose last touchdown came in Week 4. There's very little chance that Desmond Ridder lights up this Panthers secondary, and while I hate to sit a guy coming off of a career-high game, this is just a terrible matchup. Baker Mayfield versus Green Bay. Baker Mayfield hasn't really been a bad streaming option this year. He's QB 15 on the season, and while he doesn't have massive upside, you can get that 16 to 20 fantasy point range fairly consistently from him. The Bucs play Green Bay this week, and Green Bay's defense has been a bit inconsistent due to injuries. They're just not a good matchup, though, for low-volume quarterbacks. Baker Mayfield has one 300-yard passing performance this season and has averaged less than 200 yards per game over the past 4 games. The best way to attack Green Bay is on the ground, and Rachaad White is on a hot streak with 2 100-yard rushing performances over the past 3 weeks. I'd expect Tampa to lean into the run and Baker's upside to be limited in this matchup. Devin Singletary versus Tennessee. This is just a very risky matchup with volatile outcomes. CJ Stroud is still in concussion protocol, and Davis Mills is likely to get the start. It's possible that with Mills at quarterback, the Texans opt to increase volume on the ground. But this is a risky matchup to do so. Despite last week's strange game against Miami where Tua struggled and Raheem Mostert led the way, the Titans' run defense has typically been a tough matchup, allowing less than 4 yards per carry to opposing running backs. Dameon Pierce's return hasn't been fantastic for Dameon Pierce, but it does seem to have taken the top off of Devin Singletary's upside. Singletary is a risky start in Week 15. Javonte Williams versus Detroit. Detroit's defense has fallen apart against the pass, but stopping the run is the one place they've stayed solid and consistent. Opposing running backs are averaging just 3.5 yards per carry against them, and there is no running back that has surpassed 67 rushing yards this season against them. The only backs that have found success is through touchdowns, and that's a major problem for Javonte Williams. Williams had his first rushing touchdown of the season last week, and that was against a struggling LA Chargers defense. Without a touchdown, we're looking at a game of around 10 fantasy points for Williams. It's a safe floor if you have to start him, but if you need upside to win, avoid this matchup. Jake Browning versus Minnesota. I have been very pro Jake Browning, and he has been one of my preferred streaming options for the past 2 weeks. But those were good matchups, and to put it simply, I cannot put my fantasy playoff trust in a guy that is making his 4th career start in a bad matchup. Minnesota gave up a couple of big performances to big-name quarterbacks earlier in the season, but they have clamped down, holding guys like Justin Fields, Brock Purdy, and Jordan Love to under 15 fantasy points. I would expect a similar result this week for Browning. And finally, Trevor Lawrence versus Baltimore. Don't let last week's performance by Matt Stafford against Baltimore fool you. Baltimore's defense is one of the toughest overall matchups in the NFL. They have allowed just slightly over 200 passing yards per game and have given up not a single 300-yard passing game to an opposing quarterback. There is one caveat to this game, and it could be Trevor Lawrence's saving grace. Jacksonville's pass defense has been so bad, and it is entirely possible that Baltimore scores a ridiculous amount of points on them, and Lawrence has to chase points and chuck the ball another 50 times. And that scenario would certainly give him a solid fantasy game. I'm not willing to risk it though. If you're in the fantasy playoffs, you likely didn't get there by starting Trevor Lawrence every single game. Pivot to your secondary option. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And remember, if you want a chance to win a glorious fantasy football championship belt for your league, courtesy of our good friends at Trophy Smack, the #1 destination for epic fantasy football trophies, you need to subscribe to the FantasyPros YouTube channel right now. Drop a comment below on this video, and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can know when new videos are up and to claim your prize.